Hey Nick, I saw you tweeted something, so I had to jump all over it. That's what I'm all about. About seizing the social media moment. And you tweeted a diagram that basically showed that cells need to be stretched, and if cells don't stretch, they're not going to thrive, and ultimately they will die. And maybe that's an oversimplification on my part, but can you talk a bit about why you posted that, what you get out of it, and how it relates to your experience and your research in the area of stretching?
Sure, Derek. Yeah, the interesting, and you oversimplified it, but that's basically it. Cells need to stretch in order to survive. There was some studies, that particular thing that you were talking about, the article that I posted. Well, I actually posted the diagram from that article, which basically the name of the article is Why Do Cells Stretch? And basically, they need that mechanical stimulus because stretching is a mechanical stimulus that's very, very important for the ability for cells to grow, to migrate, to differentiate. And if they don't have that mechanical stimulus, they will die. And if you look at the diagram, what happens is that the cells no longer are deformed, they become apoptotic, which basically means that they become circular. It's interesting to think that we always think that cells are circular, but they're not. I mean, the only cells that aren't affected by their structure of sphericity or being circular are blood cells, but every other cell in the body, from the tendons and the cells in the muscles, the ligaments, they do need that mechanical stimulus to stay alive. Interestingly enough, what it boils down to is it boils down to its surrounding. The cell itself is surrounded by the extracellular matrix. Now, the extracellular matrix is the environment which allows the cell to communicate with its environment. So, I see the body as a hierarchy, Derek. For instance, we go from the skin to our cells, but there are sequential steps that take us from the skin to the cell itself. And this hierarchy is determined by the mechanical stimulus and determined by the subsequent extracellular matrices or the environments within the cell that allow it to stay healthy or not. And the extracellular matrix has been implicated for stuff with cancer research. If we change the environment, can we actually help the cell change its response to the environment? And a lot of my research in stretching specifically looked at the concept which is known as mechanical transduction, which basically means that the mechanical force itself becomes a stimulus, which causes a change in the cell itself, which basically causes a biochemical response.
So what you're saying is like I would think that if you had a nice circular symmetrical cell, that would be indicative of health. But what you're saying is it's not the case.
No, it's not, because the cell itself has to, in order for the cell to remain healthy, it has to communicate with its environment. And it communicates through the thing called adherents or adherent cells, integrins and ligands. The cell membrane itself, you got to realize, contains these integrins. And what integrins are, they're proteins. They're the go-between the extracellular matrix, the environment of the cell, and the cytoskeleton itself. And inside that, you have the cytosol itself. You have the cell structures itself, from the DNA, from the nucleus to the mitochondria. This whole cell inside needs to communicate with the outside, and it does that through mechanical force, mechanical stimulus. And a lot of this stuff was created by Dr. Donald Ingber at Harvard University, based on the concept of tensegrity. Interestingly enough, tensegrity is how the cells relate to the environment. What do I mean by tensegrity? Well, tensegrity was something that was created by Buckminster Fuller, the pioneer architect. He developed the geodesic dome, and he basically said that structures themselves relate to one another through compression and tension. And that's what tensegrity is. It's a compression and tension. So if the cell is being pulled one way from tension, it will cause a compression somewhere else at the cell, and that itself causes, that mechanical stress itself causes a biochemical change within the cell to respond to the stimulus that has been imposed upon it. A circular cell does not have that stimulus because it's not adhering to anything, so it's dead.
So it's like kind of like being in an anti-gravity environment. You know, you stick somebody up in the space station, they don't have gravity acting on them, and essentially they start to deteriorate.
Well, interestingly enough, you should bring that up because one of the things that we looked at with mechanical transduction is bone and how does bone respond to stress. And bone needs a force. It needs a mechanical force and a mechanical stimulus to stay healthy. And where there's so much force placed on the bone, it actually responds by creating more bone to respond to the stress that's put upon it. Now, they've shown that astronauts at zero gravity, where they aren't able to put any force on the bone itself, it actually atrophies, or it doesn't atrophy. It becomes osteoporotic. So they actually lose the structure of the bone itself. Now over years, and this is one of the problems that we're going to see with intergalactic travels to Mars, to Saturn, whatever there is. Able to create the stimulus that's going to keep that bone healthy. Now, the Russians have come up with a very, very advanced way of doing it. They use Velcro straps. What are they doing? They're trying to put the system under tension, under load. And that goes back to what we said. You need load, you need tension in the system in order for it to be healthy, because that's how it relates with its environment. There were studies done by Shikei who looked at the extracellular matrix and how by manipulating the matrix itself, they were able to cause either the increase of the cell. They were looking at a protein. Oh, it's tenacin, I think 10, which is a protein that's involved with structure. And what they did is they actually showed that by manipulating the matrix, the surrounding of the cell, and causing the cell to shift its pattern in response to the force, response to the stimulus, it was able to create more tenacin. Now, tenacin C is a extracellular matrix protein that's released when there is a stimulus imparted on the extracellular matrix itself, and that in itself communicates with the cell. So it goes back to what I said earlier on, that the cell needs that communication because it's adhered to its environment, and that adherence itself causes the ability for it to communicate. And this is the important thing. Cells communicate with one another through mechanical stimulus. I don't know if I mentioned Buckminster Fuller with the concept of tensegrity, which again, it's very, very important because tensegrity basically looks at compression and tension at the same time. So when the cell itself is exposed to that mechanical stimulus, where there's tension, the opposite of that, somewhere else in the cell, there's a compression effect happening, and that causes the ability for the cells to produce protein in response to the mechanical stimulus.
Okay, so let me ask you this. We talk about having forces, we're talking about having mechanical action. Where do you separate training and recovery in terms of, because I've had a chance to work with you, and there were some basketball players, some great basketball players like Ray Allen, Dennis Scott, and there were instances where these types of athletes who have these busy schedules and they're moving a lot, but they're having flexibility issues. They're in pain. They're not able to get into certain positions, and it's obviously affecting their ability to play their sport. Now, if movement is important, is too much movement a problem, in your opinion? Or too much of a certain type of movement?
Too much. Well, Derek, it goes back to that whole question of specificity. I mean, we've developed a lot of athletes that are very specific, and they've lost the ability to be variable. There's no differentiation. Like, I mean, I think what we have to look at more importantly is looking at the three parameters of any type of program, which are intensity, frequency, and duration. Now, if we could vary those three parameters, we could actually, in effect, start helping the athlete recover while they're still in a somewhat movement pattern. I mean, by decreasing the intensity of that movement pattern, by lessening or elongating the duration of the pattern, and by exposing them to more frequency or less frequency. This is how we manipulate the athlete. Now, very, very important from a recovery point of view, we have to offload the body because the load itself on the body causes the breakdown of the tissue. Now you're going to say, but Nick, you're telling me that mechanical stimulus is very important. It is, but to a certain extent. If it's all repetitive, like repetitive strain, the body breaks down. That's when, as a coach and an athlete or a therapist, we have to look at what the environment, because you got to realize that the environment of the athlete, which is his sporting surrounding, it's the same thing with the cell. The cell itself has its own environment, the extracellular matrix. And we have to basically look at these and basically decide how are we going to manipulate these environments, i.e. the athlete's environment, i.e. the extracellular matrix environment, to help the cells recover, which is very, very important. As you well know from the work that you and I have done with these athletes in the NBA, we also have to look at their injuries. What has caused their injuries and why are they injured? And we have to look at how loading the body itself and the injury that the athlete has. Like, for instance, Derek, I often believe that a lot of athletes are brought back onto the field, onto the court way too soon because some medical doctor or some physiotherapist says to themselves or does these neurological tests or mechanical tests, and they say, yeah, you've passed all these tests. But the one thing they haven't really looked at is the compensational shifts in that body. They haven't really been addressed. Yeah, the athlete is able to get back on the court, but have we really looked at the balance between the right and left side of their bodies? If they had a left knee injury, I will tell you right now that they will not generate the same amount of force on that left knee as opposed to the right knee, or vice versa. So we've got to really look at how load compensation affects the body, and then we can manipulate that through introduction of proper intensity, duration, and frequency.
Well, it's very interesting because in a professional sports environment, everything is about routine and repetition and the travel and the games and the practice and the meetings. And so I think you're right. There is some problem with having this consistency, I guess, without the variability. And so a lot of people will look at, well, what does the game look like? Well, we have to keep reproducing that because that's obviously going to yield us the most benefit. Where what you're saying is a lot of the time we have to look at what's missing or what's not part of the equation, and that might be something of a lower intensity. Sometimes it might be something of a higher intensity, which I found with sprinting, there's not a lot of high-speed running in sport. So
Right.
maybe that's something you do, but then maybe on the low end you're doing more static stretching, elongation, to help with some of these issues that you've encountered.
Again, with my issues, Derek, when we worked with the Grizzlies, and then we did other work in the NBA and all this, the one thing that was really flashed itself at me was the the inability to actually take that body that has just been exposed to a lot of trauma. You got to realize an athlete is a study in trauma. That's what they are. And we have to take that traumatized body and lessen or decrease the stimulus on that body by introducing methods or means that are like, I like what you said a long time ago, noise reduction. We have to reduce that noise in the body. The body's inundated. It's sympathetically loaded. The SNS is firing like crazy, and the body's breaking down. Cortisol is going through the body like crazy. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is firing like crazy. We have to take that whole response and decrease it. We have to help it download, or what's the best word, to
Well,
dial down its frequency.
yeah, and I think by doing this, you're trying to make them more adaptable, I guess, to new stimulus, and if you keep hammering them with the same stimulus, you're not going anywhere. They're going to over
Oh
adapt.
yeah, adaptation happens when you introduce the body to a new stimulus, and it goes through its whole process of responding to that new stimulus. That's why we increase the intensity, or we increase increase the duration. When we're looking at recovery of that body, we need to basically bring in another way of adapting. I think more importantly, bring back what they really need, which is proper rest. Athletes do not rest properly. And this is the one thing that we have to look at from a recovery point of view. And we have to look at, we lessen that load on that body. So how are we going to lessen that load on a body that's been playing basketball for an hour or hockey for an hour? Well, we offload the body by putting them on their back or putting them or lying down or supporting their bodies in ways and means that are going to relax as much of the neural response, to relax as much of the muscles as possible, because the nervous system is still firing even after the athlete has played.
But would you agree that in some cases total rest is not the answer? Like
Oh,
total
no, no,
inactivity.
no, no. No
So
total rest.
so
No.
this gets us back to what is the role of proper stretching?
Exactly. I mean, total rest, they no, total rest actually does not help. So what you need to do is you introduce stretching techniques that basically place a load on the body, but not a load that is conducive to creating damage. And this is where my thesis specifically looked at stretching intensity, because intensity is a magnitude, it is a force. And when you are looking at helping that body recover, you have to look at something that is going to diminish a lot of mechanical stress on that tissue, which takes us back to the beginning of this discussion about mechanical stress and the manipulation of the mechanical stress or stimulus, which can help the cell recover. Too much of it can actually help the cell break down. Now, how does it break down? If there's too much intensity in the system, and here's an interesting thing. I know there's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to listen to this and think this guy is full of, you know, doo-doo or whatever. But let me tell you something, guys. I've worked with a lot of people in the martial arts. I've worked with people in ballet. And the one thing that amazes me at nauseum is how when these people stop that particular form of stretching, which is aggressive, which is painful, which is a discomfort, they lose a lot of range of motion.
Same in gymnastics. I've had that with the gymnasts that I've worked with, where when they stop doing all of the, extreme spinal flexion and extension, as soon as they stop, they solidify. They almost crystallize in spot, right?
Well, exactly. And you know what really happens, Derek, is the one thing, it goes back to mechanical stimulus again. When you look at the brain, when the body's exposed to a new form of activity, it goes through degeneration, it goes through inflammation, it goes through what's the oh my God, I'm losing it. Fibrosis, and then regeneration. But the problem is that when you introduce aggressive stretching, you are continually developing fibrotic tissue through oh my God, now I'm starting to lose it. It's called the transforming growth factor beta 1 and the fibroblast growth factors. These are cytokines, and these are released, which basically means that the body continues to develop fibrotic tissue, which I think causes that increase in range of motion, but it's not a healthy increase in range of motion. It's not a healthy elongation. It's an elongation caused by the development of fibrotic tissue. Now, when that particular athlete stops that aggressive stretching, they lose that range of motion because the fibrotic tissue itself begins to contract.
So it's kind of a shortcut. They're taking a shortcut, an easy way out, short-term gain, long-term pain.
Exactly, Derek. You hit it on the nail. A lot of these athletes, their body is constantly inundated with what I really like, what you've said in the past, noise, noise, noise. The body is not allowed to basically, how do you say, turn off that dial or turn down that dial to allow it to basically heal from the load that it's been exposed to.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that noise is bad because all the research I've been doing shows that we need certain levels of noise in our system for optimal brain function, for postural, reinforcement, balance, all these things, right? Proprioception. So
But if
noise
it's
is important.
excessive,
If it's excessive, it's destructive.
exactly. And this is what we're saying. If it is excessive, you know.
So so what's the take home in terms of we started off with cells need to stretch to thrive and survive. Um, what can you give as sort of a take home message saying, okay, how much stretching, how intense, how do you integrate it into somebody's program so it's not excessive, it's not it's not repetitive, it's not piling on more load and more work.
I
It
think
is
I think
regenerative.
I think what's very, very important is we have to look at again the fact is that the one parameter that basically determines, I mean, duration and frequency are important, but intensity. The intensity itself is very, very important. So when we're looking to offload the body, when we're looking to help that body recover, we need to diminish the intensity of the stretch itself. Because as I said earlier on, intense stretching causes more fibrotic tissue. So when we're trying to help that body heal, we need to diminish that load. Now, stretching, and you know this, Derek, from all the work that we've done together, I always believe that stretching needs to be taken out of the athlete's environment and put into another environment, which is basically before they go to sleep, which is very, very important. Or if or 2 hours post, because those 2 hours post activity, the body has basically got rid of as much lactic acid as possible because it takes anywhere between 30 to 60 seconds to remove lactic. I mean, 30 to 60 minutes. Sorry, guys, minutes, not seconds, to remove as much lactic acid as possible. You want to replenish the glycogen and glucose that's been lost because of the muscle fatigue and the neural fatigue. So once that body is basically stepped down properly, that's when you introduce proper intense, low intense stretching that can help the body with dealing with the load that it was exposed to.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'd be interested to see if anybody has any feedback on what you've offered. I just thought the illustration that you posted was compelling, and again, it might have been an oversimplification, stretch or die, but I think there's a lot to be gained from it. And you're right. I don't think people are taking the necessary time outside of training. It's integrated as part of training. People may rush it. People may overstretch in training, right? They may think, "Oh, okay, this is going to solve all my problems if I stretch harder." So,
Because you see the bottom line, Derek, the athlete is conditioned to think that they need to continue to move. They need to continue to be active.
more is
They need
better.
to continue, pardon me?
More is better, right?
More is better, but no, less is better. And that's been shown countless of times. When even when the body, and you know this better than me, that in order for you get an athlete ready to compete, you're not going to have them continue sprinting the day before their major competition. You're going to offload them. You're going to, what's that term? Where
Taper
you
them
get
down.
taper. Thank you. You're going to taper them. Well, let's do mini tapers, micro tapers, throughout the season, whether we're going to have them compete or not. But those micro tapers are very, very important for recovery.
No, I agree, and I mean, we've had discussions about microdosing of other training stimuli too, and I think that's what it's coming down to is, and I don't like the term like minimum effective dose because I don't think that's necessarily the right thing as well. You have
Well,
to,
it's almost like saying one step quickness.
yeah, 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 military intelligence. But yeah, I think it's needed for every coach, every practitioner to find out what the necessary dose is, right? And I think it's so easy to go, oh, practice is 2 hours, so we're going to practice 2 hours, or they like to compartmentalize stuff and oversimplify it and just okay, let's just do this. And So hopefully we've made people think a bit more.
We always, a lot of people, they basically look at a certain way, they think a certain way, and they think that that's it. No, 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 guys. You have to think outside of the box, and especially when you're looking at mechanical load, because this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with mechanical loading of the body, and how can we best take that mechanical load, remove as much adverse effect that it's had on the body, and then keep what is beneficial, which is very, very important.
Yeah, and I'm going to simplify it even more. I think just people should think. You know, in the box, outside of the box, I don't care. Just think.
Just think, guys.
Okay, thanks a lot, man.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.